So important was this external recognition by others, or fame, give it a title, that for writers or artists it could take the place of money, and very dearly so. As an apprentice writer in Paris in the 1920s, Fitzgerald and Hemingway met and became very close friends. But at that time, Hemingway was scornful about what he thought was Fitzgerald's obsession with how much money he was paid for his stories by the Saturday Evening Post. Later in his life, however, Hemingway himself demanded compensation for his magazine work, at least slightly higher than anyone else was getting. The attitude toward money changed as his career went on, and so did his attitude toward fame. And it was fame more than money that drove him, I'm sure. Leo Braudy, in an excellent book called The Frenzy of Renown, compares Hemingway with Lindbergh as Midwestern lads, approximate contemporaries, and self-made men who gained international fame through mastery of a professional craft. In Braudy's judgment, fame both gives and takes away. In part it celebrates uniqueness, and in part it requires that uniqueness be exemplary and reproducible, as in, some of you may remember, Franklin D. Roosevelt's jauntily displayed cigarette holder, or Winston Churchill's V, or Hemingway's signature beard. So we pursue fame then to escape drab anonymity, but upon reaching that objective we find ourselves depreciated by the gaze others fix upon us, because all of those repetitions of those gestures have a way of devaluing the original. In his book on Hemingway's fame, John Rayburn emphasized two basic points. First, Hemingway was the most celebrated of American writers. Both slick magazines aimed at the college-educated and pulp publications designed for the hoi polloi kept their readers informed about him, his exploits, while syndicated columnists like Leonard Lyons and Earl Wilson reported on his trips to New York and on their trips down to visit him in Cuba. Rayburn's second comment about Hemingway was that far from being either the unwitting or unwilling recipient of this personal attention, as he liked to intimate he was, Hemingway was the architect of his public reputation. I think that's true. I think he adopted the Papa persona as a way of evading too much attention to himself as an aesthete. Certainly, as the outdoorsman, the warrior, the boxer, the hunter, the fisherman, the bullfight aficionado, Hemingway was doing things that inspired people to talk about it. But unlike Fitzgerald in the 1920s, he was far less openly engaged in building a reputation as Fitzgerald was early on. But later on, that changed. So perhaps the most telling change was Lillian Ross's 1950 article in the New Yorker profile called About Hemingway, which presented him as something of a buffoon. He was at the time. He just finished his worst book, Across the River Into the Trees, and had come to New York, and Ross followed him around for 3 days and recorded everything he said and put it all into this profile. And he said a good many foolish and on a holiday kinds of things. Perhaps the most memorable passage in that portrait, he compared his own writing to that of great figures from the past, employing metaphors from the world of sport. A novelist, he said, was like a starting pitcher with no relievers in the bullpen. Novelist has to go the full 9, even if it kills him. He said. During his Paris years, he said, he had perfected his pitching by reading such French masters as Mr. Flaubert, who always threw them perfectly straight, hard, high, and inside. Mr. Baudelaire, that I learned my knuckleball from, and Mr. Rimbaud, who never threw a fastball in his life. Then he switched to boxing instead of baseball to lay claim to his place in this company. Quotation from Lillian Ross's profile. I started out very quiet and I beat Mr. Turgenev. Then I trained hard and I beat Mr. de Maupassant. I fought 2 draws with Mr. Ston Hall I think I had an edge in the last one, but nobody's going to get me in any ring with Mr. Tolstoy unless I'm crazy or I keep getting better. Okay, so what seems clear retrospectively? Well, Hemingway is on holiday and you know, just having fun, but and that comes through some of it. But he, since Ross doesn't provide any comment to that effect, she just presents the way it was, so he emerges as something of a well, I suppose jerk, and he was not, you know. So what seems clear retrospectively is that Hemingway, during those 3 days, and often, especially when he was not working, and he was a very hard worker all of his life when he was working, and he worked most of his life, that he was determined to distance himself from the conventional image of the artist as an aesthete. He was no innocent victim of the press. He knew why Ross was at his elbow and the kind of reporting she did. If possible, maybe he wanted it both ways. He wanted to be recognized for his mastery of fiction as an artist, and at the same time as a rugged, manly fellow, so he emerged from that profile as one of the roughs, in Whitman's phrase, perhaps the roughest of all, the man who wrestled bears, spoke pidgin English, and by the way, wrote some of the most enduring stories and novels of his time. The sensitive tough guy is a cliche, I suppose, and Hemingway was cast in that part at least as early as 1933 when William Steig, the cartoonist, drew a cartoon depicting him with a rose in his hairy fist, tattooed fist. It was the fist and not the rose. He had no tattoos that persisted. Hemingway's most widely reported brush with death. He was often injured, often hurt. He was subject to woundings by himself and by others. Automobile crashes, terrible accidents. But the most widely reported brush with death came in January 1954 when he and his wife Mary, on safari in Africa, survived 2 plane crashes in 2 days. When wreckage of the first crash was sighted, word went out that he'd been killed, so that Hemingway had the pleasure of reading his own obituaries. My luck, she is still good, he said afterwards, but the crashes took a tremendous toll. The second one left him with a full-scale concussion and a ruptured liver, spleen, and kidney, temporary loss of vision in the left eye, loss of hearing in the left ear, a crushed vertebra, a sprained right arm and shoulder, a sprained left leg, paralysis of the sphincter, and first-degree burns on his face, arms, and head. Carlos Baker, his first and official biographer, believed that these were the worst injuries of many that Hemingway underwent, that he never really recovered from them. A few months later, though, he was back in the news as winner of the 1954 Nobel Prize for Literature. He was still in poor health. He couldn't go to the ceremony. But he sent a statement about the loneliness of the writer and how, quote, he should always try for something that's never been done, and that others have tried and failed. With luck, success might follow, but only if the writer was willing, like Santiago and the Old Man in the Sea, to be driven out far, out past where he can go, driven far, out past where he can go, and out to where no one can help him. In that statement, I suppose, he was trying to present himself, present the artist as the hero, instead of the rugged man who went to all the wars of his time and suffered terrible injuries. Most would agree that Hemingway did write his greatest fiction in the 1920s, although he produced important and valuable books for 30 years later. Like many American authors, he had the problem of encore, how he's supposed to improve on the wonderful stories written during the Paris years and the 2 great novels, The Sun Also Rises and Farewell to Arms. His celebrity exacerbated the difficulty as the general public concentrated its gaze on the exploits of his private life and only occasionally could be roused to acknowledge that Papa Hemingway, they knew, was an artist as well.